The abiotic and biotic factors, they interact, and the interactions between them actually influence population dynamics and something called carrying capacity of the environment. It's these interactions between abiotic and biotic factors that actually creates this thing called a carrying capacity. So, one quick thing to do, what do we mean by population? Well, a population is a group of organisms of the same species. We now know what we mean by species, that live in the same area at the same time and are capable of interbreeding. It's an expansion on the idea of species. So in this example, there's some edible mussels growing on a rocky shore in South Wales in the UK. They are populations, they're grouped together. Yeah. So how does this link together with this idea of niche and resources and the interactions? Well, as long as resources are plentiful, populations grow. If a population is healthy, from the resources that it's got access to food, space, etc., they're going to reproduce and the population should grow. And we can define population growth in terms of an equation. Don't really need it, but if you think about other things that you've done, it's a very, very similar equation to any growth equation. Acceleration, speed, they're all growth equations. However, we do know that population growth is not simple. So, if we were to put some bacterial cells in a culture, they'd start growing. And we get a graph of number of cells that would look something like this over, here I've got 300 minutes, yeah? So we've got a population growth rate. And what you can see immediately is that the graph is not straight. There's a change of rate in the population growth. So we've got changing rates of population growth throughout the graph. This is because of positive feedback. As the population grows, the possibility of the population growing faster increases, and it produces something called a J-curve. And the J-curve assumes that resources aren't limited, that if there's an infinite amount of resources available to a population, it would keep on growing forever and ever and ever. You can think of that in terms of human population growth as well. There's quite a worry at the moment that we're actually using more resources on the planet than we've actually are capable of replacing. So all these graphs actually have a real bearing on human population growth as well. So this growth can also be modeled as an equation. And we get a rate equation, we get a rate of change. And so if the population changed by 4% every generation, our rate of population growth would be 0.4 times n. However, we know that a population can't keep on growing forever and ever. So Darwin, as well as talking about evolution, actually did quite a lot of other studies as well. And he calculated that if we started with 2 elephants and only had exponential growth, that after 700 years, the world population of elephants would be around 19 million. Obviously, there aren't 19 million elephants on the planet. So there are things that control the size of any population. And these limits produce something called a carrying capacity. The size of any population is limited by the resources that are available to it. And so any ecosystem environment will only sustain a certain number of organisms inside a population. And we call this the carrying capacity. So we're going to have a look again at bacterial cells to sort of see what happens as resources get limit. So, in this example, as you can see, we can see the bacterial cells actually start to level off at a certain population size. So this produces something called a sigmoid growth curve. Yeah? In this example, it's round about 120 cells. that it's this leveled off at. This is because the resources that were available to the bacterial cells have started to be used up. There's a limited number of resources, so the population can only sustain a certain level. Yeah, and we call the level that the environment, and in this case it's the petri dish that the population is growing in, we call this level that can be sustained the carrying capacity of the environment. And ecologists use the letter K to represent this. Again, we can model this as an equation, and this gives us something called the logistical equation, which is a very famous equation, not only in ecology, but in population studies. And it includes a component that actually slows down. So as populations get towards the carrying capacity, the rate of growth tends to slow down. And we can see that inside the graph again, that the population has slowed down as its growth rate has slowed down. Now, we have various phases inside this growth model, inside this sigmoid model. The rate of population growth is changing depending how resources are being utilized in each phase. So let's go through phase by phase. So first of all, we have this thing called the lag phase. The population is growing slowly. We're starting off with a small population. Resources are not limiting at this point, but the population is too small to really start exploiting them. And as the population grows, it starts to exploit the resources more and more, and then therefore starts to actually grow quicker, which then leads us to the next phase, which is this logistic or exponential growth phase. And in this phase, the population is making a lot of use of the resources. Resources are still not limiting through this growth. So the population grows faster and faster. As the population grows faster, then the next generation of population grows faster because they're not being limited by the resources. And eventually we get into the third phase of it, where the population growth starts to slow down. As the resources become limiting, that makes it much harder for the population to utilize the resources until the population gets to a point where it can't get any more resources than it can utilize at this stage. The resources actually limit the population growth. So let's look at this with our example of the barnacles. So because of the competition, the resources for both actually were reduced. So therefore the population of each is actually lower than it would be if there wasn't any competition. The carrying capacity of that environment is actually lowered for each species. The total amount of resources hasn't changed, it's just the carrying capacity for each species is lowered. Their ability to actually use the resources change. So that would give us a graph something like this. The red line is the theoretical carrying capacity, or the maximum population size without any competition. So if there wasn't any competition between the two species, both species, they would actually have a bigger population size. But because they're competing with each other, their population size is smaller. Their carrying capacity that they have access to is smaller. Therefore, their realized niche is smaller. There's competition between them. This tends to happen in terms of populations separating out. Just as we see in the example with the two barnacle species, that they actually inhabit different parts of the beach. So they're not directly competing with each other, but they're competing for very similar resources, and therefore they can't move out of their zone, their realized niche area. Competition itself may actually produce another outcome. If the competition is so great and one population has a very slight advantage, it will outcompete the other population. So again, if you think back to each of our barnacle species, in the area where they end up in their realized niche, this is what they've done to each other. They've outcompeted each other. So where balance is found, it has replaced Cathalmus. It's totally replaced it. It's outcompeted it for the same resources. And this is one of the outcomes that's possible with competition. So across the entire environment of the rocky shore, they are sharing the total resources. But inside the areas where they're found, they've actually outcompeted each other and replaced each other. So that's competition for resources. But let's look directly at competition between species. So a predator-prey relationship is a form of competition. The predator is trying to catch the prey is trying not to be caught. and they're linked together. And in thinking of this, we can actually think about herbivores as being a predator and prey. The herbivore is preying on the plant species. So we also have a predator-prey relationship. So when the interaction only involves animals, we call that predation. But when the predator-prey relationship involves animals that eat plants, we call that herbivory. So let's have a look at a classic example of a relationship between predators and prey. So, snowshoe hare and the lynx population in the northern USA and Canada. So this was a classic study that was done a long time ago, and actually was one of the first studies that actually created or thought of these links that exist. And as you notice, there are two peaks in this graph, and the peak for the population size of the lynx always seems to follow the peak for the population size of the snowshoe hare. So if we look at our illustration at the side of it, we can sort of see that in terms of what's actually happening. So if we start with this loop, and it's actually a negative feedback loop. If we start with the prey population growing, so the prey population grows, it gets bigger. That allows more food to be available for the predator population, and the predator population starts to grow slightly afterwards. But as the predator population grows, that creates a hunting pressure. There's more hunting, so the population of the prey, the snowshoe hare population, starts to fall. As the snowshoe hare population starts to fall, there's less food for the predator population. So the predator population follows that, and then that starts to fall. But as the predator population starts to fall, there's less hunting of the snowshoe hare. So with less hunting, the prey population starts to grow again. And we get a repeat of this continuously. We get this continuous cycling, this negative feedback. Okay, let's try and pull some of these ideas together in terms of a case study.